Hello everyone and welcome to my guide on passing and initiative in Legends of Runeterra. Now we'll start off with some basic concepts and definitions just for the beginners and newer players, and so we're all on the same page. And then I'll go into detail and show you guys a bunch of examples of all of the possible situations where it makes sense to press the pass or end turn button and what that implies for our decision making and game plan. Having initiative means having the current action and therefore being first to act. This is a very common concept across strategy and card games. It's also often referred to as priority or other names, but I'll stick with initiative for this one. In Runeterra, whoever has the attack token has initiative on that turn and has the first action. However, you don't always want to have the first action of the turn, depending on whether you're playing a more proactive or a more reactive deck. And to understand when passing and ending a turn is good, we need to understand these two concepts. Generally speaking, we need proactive plays to accomplish our win condition, to put units onto the board, to attack our opponent, to threaten to put their Nexus health to 0, or win in any other way. Usually aggro decks and like very fast tempo mid-range decks are very proactive decks that do not have many reactive plays within them. A great example would be the Darrowing deck that was very common before it got hit by a bunch of nerfs. And on the other hand, we have reactive decks that also at some point want to close out the game with a proactive combo. Like for example, dropping a War Mothers, dropping a Commander Ledros into an Atrocity. But until they have the right cards in hand and enough mana to actually play that combo, they want to stall out the game by reactively removing all of our opponent's threats and making them run out of value in hand or on board, basically grinding the game out. And yeah, good examples for reactive decks would be like control decks, Shadow Isles control, and certain combo decks like Ezreal Karma is a great deck with a lot of reactivity. So in order to know how we should play our deck, we need to understand the win conditions in our deck. We also need to know the most common matchups, and we always need to ask ourselves the question, is our deck the faster or the slower deck? Is our deck gonna try to achieve its win conditions before our opponent, therefore making it the faster deck, or after our opponent and therefore making it the slower deck? And generally speaking, whenever we try to close out the game faster, we try to play proactively. And whenever we try to stall out the game and then finish off our opponent, we try to play reactively. Now, it is important to note that in certain situations, the generally slower deck that holds more value can sometimes still become the proactive and faster deck. For example, if a control deck draws all of their early minions and rather aggressive cards early on and just overruns the faster deck, who only draw their top-end finishers though. Therefore, we always need to reassess whether we're playing for value and try to be reactive, or whether we play for tempo and try to be proactive and close out the game quickly. Certain cards are usually much better when they're used proactively, and others when they're used reactively. A great example of a mainly proactive card would be Precious Pet. It finds most value if you drop it on turn 1 and just bypass your opponent's champ blockers and hit your opponent's face for like on turn 1, turn 3, and turn 5 on the attacks. Nonetheless, it can also be used as a blocker if you need it. It's just a very inefficient blocker. A great example of a reactive card is Grasp of the Undying. You'll mainly find that in control decks. It removes threats from your opponent and heals you. It can't stabilize you very well in the mid game. Nonetheless, even a card as reactive as this can also be used proactively, right? If you currently have the board advantage and try to remove blockers from your opponent's side of the board, Grasp of the Undying can also accomplish that, even though in a very inefficient way. And last of all, I want to look at a hybrid card that can be quite valuable both offensively and defensively. So a card like Arachnoid Sentry is going to be very good reactively if you try to stop your opponent's attack, because it stuns one unit and gives you an additional blocker in the same action. While it can also be very good on an aggressive, proactive attack push, because it stuns a blocker and gives you an additional attacking body. So fellas, it's kind of important to understand and know which cards are better when they're used proactively, which cards are better when they're used reactively, and That will make you understand better how your deck works, how your opponent's deck works, and who plays at which speed, and who's currently in the proactive seed, in the reactive seed, and so on. Generally speaking, as the proactive player, you want initiative, because it gives you the option to either develop units onto the board or play big threatening spells, and it also, very important, gives you the option to open attack. That means to start your turn with an attack with your whole board before your opponent gets the chance to play any unit of their own or any slow speed spell of their own, and therefore your opponent can only answer with fast or burst spells. And on the other hand, generally speaking, the person who's currently playing reactively does not want initiative, because that person first wants to see what kind of units or spells their opponent develops before they choose which one is the biggest threat to remove or to deal with their reactive spells. And that's where a lot of the passing comes from, which I will take a deeper look into in a second. But first, another thing to note here is that as the reactive player, you generally want to react as late as possible until you otherwise get threatened to either waste mana or take Nexus damage or anything like that. For example, if you're up against an aggro deck and it's obvious that your opponent will attack later this turn, then it's best to save all of your fast spells for that attack, because then your opponent cannot develop any bigger threats anymore. A great example would be if you're playing against a Noxus aggro deck and you're planning to play Grasp of the Undying this turn on your opponent's attack. Now let's say your opponent still has 4 mana left. If you already play Grasp of the Undying, you run into the threat of your opponent playing Noxian Fervor over the top, which does not only prevent the 3 healing you would get, but also deals 3 damage to you. And that's usually pretty atrocious in this matchup. So if you otherwise wait, pass first, and your opponent maybe develops something like a Draven, not only does your opponent tap out of mana to play Noxian Fervor, but you also have a great target for Grasp of the Undying. And even if this does not happen, just you having the mana up and threatening a Grasp of the Undying might prevent your opponent from developing more, because he himself wants to keep mana up for Noxian Fervor to react to your spell. Alright, now let's take a look at some more practical examples. So most of the time we click the pass or end turn button, it's because either we don't have mana to play the cards in our hand, because we don't have any sensible plays. That is, we could only play, for example, Vile Feast or Grasp of the Undying onto our own unit here. Or we don't have any cards in hand and already say we used up our attack, we cannot do any action anymore. For a lot of beginners, those are the only situations where they pass, but I will show you a lot more examples where a strategic pass can be very beneficial to you. First, I will show you what an open pass looks like. This is a strategy commonly used by the more reactive deck in the matchup, the slower deck, and its purpose is to first make your opponent commit to more resources to develop more stuff so that you can then get more value from your removal, or you have better choices as to which unit you want to target with certain spells. So we're in this situation against an Ash Sejuani deck where our opponent does have a board advantage, but it's not really that threatening yet, right? The problem with playing Ruination right away is that our opponent still has 6 mana to redevelop the board, and our opponent did not play the Yeti yet, so our opponent might actually build up a scarier board after the Ruination than what is on board right now. Another thing to note here is that with the Grasp of the Undying and Vengeance in hand, we can totally handle our opponent's open attack if the turn was to end right now. So what we can do is keep the mana for our Ruination up and first see if our opponent commits more resources onto the board. And this is called an open pass because we pass as the first action of our turn. So we keep Ruination mana up, our opponent realizes, okay, this attack is not scary enough yet, I'm forced to develop more if I do want to threaten to actually close out the game. And our opponent does expend their Yeti, and we suddenly have a much better Ruination and much less threat of redevelopment after the Ruination. So we can easily Ruinate here, and then we still have mana for a Vengeance on the next turn in case opponents does decide to open attack. Now we need to be careful to not get too greedy with the open passing though, because our opponent can punish our greed by just ending the turn and passing back in case our opponent's open attack is really scary, or our opponent also has offensive combat tricks that might throw us off. So here we have a kind of similar situation from a different game though. The main difference is that the open attack is a lot scarier. Nonetheless, currently with the 2 grasps, we can easily withstand an attack, but we do get wrecked by combat tricks. Now let's see how this situation unfolds. So our opponent does not fall for the bait this time, does not commit any more Yetis or resources. Ends the turn and goes for the open attack. Now if we look at our hand right now, we are kind of fine with this attack using the 2 grasps in hand. But keep in mind that a card like Fury of the North onto the Ash or Elixir of Iron, like double Elixir of Iron onto both units, would end the game right here on the spot. And another thing to note here is that even after this attack we did survive, but our opponent still has 7 mana to develop. And we don't have any board and we're on low Nexus health. So we will be in a tough spot again. Alright, same game. Now let's look at the same situation, but the board state is looking even more dire. Right here, right now, we don't have any chance of surviving an open attack. And our opponent also knows that there's no real combination of cards in our hand, or in our deck rather, that can save us from this open attack. So here a pass is what I would call a greed pass. This only works if you know that your opponent is has a tendency to always develop and use up all their mana. In higher levels of play, this is not going to happen to you. You will get punished by your opponent just ending the turn and open attacking. Note that if we would have just opened up with Ruination last turn, we still would have had mana to use both whales on this turn's attack, and there would have been a good chance we would have survived this attack. So the open pass overall is a super valuable tool. As a general rule of thumb, you say if you're fine with your opponent's open attack, but make sure you're not greed passing and cannot handle the situation if your opponent passes back and open attacks. Otherwise, you will get punished pretty severely with a pass back. Let's look at another similar situation to explore one more play we can make. Now, note the main difference this time is we don't actually have Ruination in hand, but we do have mana to threaten a Ruination. So as soon as you get to a level where your opponents are good enough to actually play around their opponent's cards, you can bluff certain big removal cards to prevent your opponent from developing and committing more onto the board, even though you would not have a perfect answer for that. Now, right now, a Withering Whale and the Spider to Chump block kind of deals with this attack very efficiently, so we are fine with taking the bluff open pass. Just make sure you don't do this in situations where it would be a greed pass and where you get punished very heavily by your opponent passing back and ending the turn. And here's an example of when it can actually make sense to pass, even though you are the faster deck and trying to finish your opponent as fast as possible. Now, again, we are playing against the War Mother's deck. This time we are the Ash deck. And we know our opponent runs Ruinations and Vengeances. And we kind of don't want to make the mistake of overcommitting, running into a Ruination, and then not having anything to refill the board and therefore kind of running out of steam. So our opponent might play something like a Hapless Aristocrat here to kind of debate us into that he does not want to play Ruination this turn. This, especially at lower level, leads a lot of players to then develop more. For example, drop the Yeti here and then just tank a Ruination, which ends the game. But what we can consider here is, say, especially if we had additional combat tricks, this is unfortunately not a perfect example, but say we had Elixir of Iron or Fury of the North. If we just open attack, we pull the blocker aside. If these connect, especially with Fury, it's pretty much GG. Now, we did not fall for the bait, we passed. Our opponent does end up using the Ruination. We draw a card of the Sentry and we can refill our board very comfortably. We can even play the Conic Strike on the Spider and threaten lethal with the open attack. So as a general rule of thumb, if you are the faster player trying to beat down your opponent quickly, if you already have a board that is most likely to get lethal, it really threatens your opponent, there's no need to overcommit resources, especially if you are playing around the Ruination or heavy big target removal. Now this clip here shows that it's often good as the reactive player to keep your combat spells for as late as possible to see what your opponent does first and then have options of removal. Now for the sake of this example, please ignore that my deck is empty. This is just a staged demo. So our opponent develops a Host Spider, and an attack here would already set us to an uncomfortable 7 HP. Well, we could definitely consider to just drop Yone here, right? It would stun 2 attackers, and we had to have the blocker for the last Spider. Generally, we can kind of nullify the attack at the current point, but this is quite the rookie mistake because we don't know yet what our opponent does with the rest of his 8 mana. So we pass, take the risk of our opponent open attacking, which really isn't that much of a risk, since we do have Static Shock and Concussive Palm as stoppers of the attack. And boom, we see our opponent drops the Leviathan here. And we can now opt to either Jury Rig Thermal Beam or Thermal Beam right away. Had we played Yone right away, then, or like Concussive Palm, we would not have had the option. And even if we could have stopped the attack more or less, the Leviathan would have still hit our Nexus for 3 damage every turn and be a huge threat in combination with the Swain. Another interesting play to make is the Burst Pass. Now in Legends of Runeterra, if you play a burst speed spell, the pass button disappears and instead an OK shows up. This gives your opponent the option to pass, and if your opponent passes, you can then end the turn. So this allows for some interesting mind games. You can either utilize this to kind of debate your opponent into developing more stuff, and then you have more options of targeting like your removal spells at high value targets. Or your opponent does not fall for the bluff, because it makes it look like you really want to play something this turn, but you first want to see what your opponent does. So if your opponent thinks that way, and he passes back, although he originally would want to develop something, you could just snap back and the round right away, and burn all of your opponent's mana. So this is a very situational play on very high level of competition. It usually doesn't get utilized much, but especially in lower levels of play, you can often kind of make your opponent take the first action of the turn without risking them to just end the turn and potentially punish you. So those were all of the situations I could think of right now where a pass can give you a benefit and can make sense. Let me know if you think I missed anything. And as you probably saw, passing is a lot about mind games, and it's a lot about predicting what kind of removal your opponent has in hand, what kind of combat tricks you're holding yourself, and how well you will be able to refill the board after, for example, a Ruination. So it's very, very situational. But if you do want to improve your gameplay, you should not only implement these sorts of passes into your gameplay, but also be able to read what a pass by your opponent could mean. So I hope this was helpful overall. If you have any recommendations for future guides, let me know in the comments or let me know in the vote box on my Twitch stream in the description. And apart from that, have a good day. Peace out. See you around.